All right. We've been watching some fascinating testimony on today, the 10th day of testimony in the Derek Chauvin murder trial. Let us get straight to our CBS News legal contributor, Jessica Levinson. She's been following this along with me. And Jessica, you and I were sort of texting, DMing back and forth about what you specifically, I think, as a legal expert, thought of the testimony there of the medical examiner, which was extremely compelling. Tell me your takeaways.
I thought she just eviscerated the defense's theory of the case. I don't think that we can pretend it's anything other than extremely cutting when it comes to what the defense is arguing here. So I thought the prosecution did a great job of a couple of things. One, they used Dr. Thomas to say our theory of the case is correct. And then two, and it's a subtle analytical shift, but I thought I saw it, which is even if you don't completely buy our theory of the case, Dr. Thomas, tell us why everything that the defense is going to argue is 100% wrong. And that's a great legal strategy in the sense of I win because I'm right. And if you don't believe me, if you think there's something slightly wrong with my particular theory of the case, you certainly cannot believe what the defense is going to argue here. So I thought, and again, they did a great job of saying basically, and you're going to hear this from the defense. Is there anything to that? No. Okay. Number two. Okay. Nothing to that. And let's be honest, Dr. Thomas, I think, was extremely credible. She was so clear. She was so knowledgeable. And she used real world examples. I mean, that example of what happens when your body is filled with adrenaline. She used the example of slamming on your brakes. Almost all of us drive. She used the example of you lose track of your toddler on the beach. So many of us have children and have had that split-second moment of, where is that child? Very relatable, very easy for the jury to understand. Complex statements, complex concepts that were made in a clear and articulate way without dumbing it down. I thought really effective witness.
Yeah, and to the point that at one point, Jessica, she said the activities of law enforcement are, I'm quoting that part, the activities of law enforcement, and I'm paraphrasing this part where she said led directly to the death of George Floyd. And you know, I expected there was going to be an objection there, but could you object? There's no objection to that that expert testimony from a forensic pathologist. Can there be?
I don't think on that particular point. I mean, we will probably look back at the defense's theory of this case and their performance for a long time. I know there's already been a lot of criticism about the fact that the defense really wasn't able to create any sort of damage yesterday when it came to the expert witnesses. And this witness, I mean, I don't think the defense is just giving up, but this is clearly, Dr. Thomas is an expert witness. How can you say I take issue with that on a legal basis? Now, the defense will say we have a different theory. And I think at this point with these expert witnesses, what the defense is going to do is, yes, they will try and undermine, they will try and create some daylight between these experts and the prosecution theory of the case. But I increasingly think this is going to come down to the defense coming up with their own experts to provide just a different set of theories, not to try and make their case through the prosecution's witnesses, not to try and make their case by undermining what the prosecution is saying, but just coming with a whole different set of expert witnesses.
So let's play some of what we just heard, and then I'll ask you to comment on it, Jessica. In the first instance here, this is the prosecution asking the forensic pathologist, her name is Dr. Lindsey Thomas, about her belief as to what actually caused George Floyd's death. She believes it is low oxygen. Let's play that.
Based on your review of the evidence and the death certificate, do you agree with Dr. Baker's determination on the cause of death?
Yes, I do.
And is that by the word immediate on here?
Yes, cardiopulmonary arrest complicating law enforcement, subdual, restraint, and neck compression.
Have you, Dr. Thomas, formed an opinion about the mechanism of death?
Yes.
Would you tell us what that is?
In this case, I believe the primary mechanism of death is asphyxia or low oxygen.
I mean, doesn't get any clearer than that.
It doesn't. And again, this is a lawyer's dream expert witness in the sense that these are difficult concepts, particularly for jurors who have not seen a death certificate before. And I hope for the sake of the jurors that many of them don't typically see death certificates. It's an emotionally difficult thing to look at. And I think that's, Vlad, why we did not see those autopsy pictures, because there was a decision that it would not be live streamed. But the idea that what she did is she took all the kind of medical jargon, all these terms that maybe we don't know exactly what they mean, or what does immediate cause mean, what does mechanism mean, and she put it in terms that were really understandable for the jury, and not only understandable, but in terms that just, again, eviscerated the defense's claim here, that there was some other complicating factor. And she explained why you can die from, let's say, asphyxiation, but still have drugs in your body. That does not mean that drugs were the cause of death. You can die from asphyxiation and still have an underlying heart condition. That does not mean that the heart condition was the cause of death. So it will be really difficult, I think, for the defense to come forward with an expert who is not only as credible, but as clear, as articulate, as methodical, as good about kind of demystifying this particular type of jargon and putting it in terms that is readily understandable for the jury. But yes, I mean, there were a number of moments I was kind of writing on my notebook, and there were a number of moments where I just starred them and thought, this is a terrible moment for the defense.
So that is her assessment as to what caused George Floyd to die. Now I want to play for you and for our audience what Dr. Thomas said about some of the things, as you pointed out, Jessica, that the defense has claimed or will claim was responsible for George Floyd's death, including, COVID and, his medical condition. Let's play that. Shot number 2.
So in this case, the autopsy ruled out, for example, underlying lung disease. Mr. Floyd had had a history of COVID, but there was no evidence in his lungs at the time of his death that he had any lung disease that would impair his ability to breathe. And it ruled out injuries to the neck that suggest that the bones in his neck had been broken, for example. And it ruled out a stroke. He didn't have a stroke, so it wasn't like his blood pressure was so high that, he ruptured a vessel in his brain. He didn't have an aneurysm. He didn't have, which is a ruptured vessel. He didn't have an embolism, which is a blood clot. He didn't rupture his heart. He didn't have an old heart attack or a recent heart attack or what's called myocardial infarct.
I mean, again, just sort of, as you said, Jessica, going point by point, using some of the very language that the defense has put forth as to the cause of death of George Floyd.
Yes, and I think she did something that we should expect from experts. And I was listening to that, and I'm obviously not a doctor. She did something that I thought was so good. She would use a word like embolism and then parenthetical, here's what that is. Aneurysm, parenthetical, here's what that is. So I know I keep harping on this point, but it is so important for experts not to just say something that's consistent with one theory of the case, but to do so in a way that the jury can understand. You can have the best credentials in the world. You can have, the best evidence in the world. But if you don't have somebody up there who can explain it to the jury, then it's really somewhat pointless. And, that's a stylistic point. I mean, to the substance of what she's saying, yes, I mean, she just went point by point and said, no, it couldn't be this. It can't be this. Let me tell you again, it has to be this. And what's the this? It's Officer Chauvin's knee on George Floyd's neck. Now, this is why I think we're not going to see, the defense will cross-examine. I think that they'll have questions, but we're not going to see the defense try and undercut Dr. Thomas. We're going to see the defense come forward with a witness that says, let's talk about excited delirium, which of course is a somewhat controversial theory. that's used in a number of these police brutality or excessive force cases. But you know, she's just the dream expert witness in terms of explaining difficult concepts in a way that you can understand. And again, using those real world examples. As a teacher, you know, this is what I strive to do with my students, is you can read a statute, really complicated. Let's talk about how this would affect you in your daily life. Let's talk about an experience you would understand. That's what she's doing here.
And, you know, I don't recall, there might have been a point too, Jessica, when the prosecutors asked her how many times she had testified before, and it was quite a high number. So she's done this before, as opposed to, for example, the use of force expert that they had in from Los Angeles the last couple of days, who had not done a lot of testifying in sort of high-profile cases like this. So you mentioned drugs, and because that is another one of the theories that the defense has as to what may have killed George Floyd. I want to play sound number 4, where when she was on the stand, she was asked about other contributing factors, including fentanyl intoxication and recent methamphetamine use. And here's what she had to say in our 4th soundbite about drug use.
How would you characterize the amount of meth in Mr. Floyd's system at the time?
Well, it was there. It's not particularly high. Certainly in deaths that I have attributed to methamphetamine, it's been much higher. But it's not like there's any safe level of methamphetamine, but this was a very low level.
So was the methamphetamine significant in your assessment of the cause of death?
No.
So then, based on your review of the video and application of your work experience and knowledge, did you rule out drug overdose as a cause of death?
Yes.
So, Jessica, imagine I'm one of your law students. Could I then, if I'm the defense attorney, say, so you just said that there isn't a safe level, any safe level of meth, but this was a very low level. So it's possible that meth could have killed him. What would you say to that?
That you would be a great law student, and I would be lucky to have you in class. And I'm sure that you would have a lot of questions, which as a professor I love, and it makes me better. But you know, back to your point. So that shoulder shrug in the beginning from Dr. Thomas, I think that really said so much. Yes, there was methamphetamines there. And I noted that she said there is no safe level, because I think actually that's key to keeping the jurors' faith in her.
That's the reason why I raised that one, because I was sort of like, she almost caught herself before she moved on to her next point where she was going to be definitive about it, because I could almost see her thinking, well, that would provide the defense counsel an opportunity to say, so what are you saying, that somebody can take meth and not die from it?
Right, exactly. And I think it's so important, and the prosecution has done this in a number of different situations. You have to acknowledge that George Floyd had a drug addiction issue. You have to acknowledge that there were drugs in his system. And you have to have an expert. You can't have an expert on the stand with a straight face saying, well, a little methamphetamine never hurt anybody. She has to acknowledge that there is no safe level. So to your specific question about, you know, will the defense come up and say, so you admit that there were methamphetamines. You admit that there's no safe level. If something is not safe, then by definition, that means it's dangerous. If it means it's dangerous, that means it's a threat to the health. And then that's how I think the defense cross-examination would go. Well, if it's a threat to your health, then it means that if you are, and then we go again to that place of trying to plant that seed of doubt in at least one of the 12 jurors. Now, 11 of the 12 can say, this is nuts. Of course it's beyond a reasonable doubt. But if one juror says, yeah, but I heard her say it wasn't safe. And then I remember the defense saying, not safe means dangerous. Dangerous means a threat to your health. Threat to your health means potential death. If you can get one juror to go down that particular line of reasoning, you might be able to plant enough reasonable doubt, at least maybe for the higher charges of second and third degree murder. At this point, the prosecution's case has been so strong, I'm not sure you could find reasonable doubt for second-degree manslaughter. But of course, we have we are not through with this case at all, and I need to be careful myself not to prejudge what's going to come, what will be coming next.
So could Derek Chauvin, in conferring with his attorneys, say, yeah, but I don't know the level of meth and drugs that's in this guy's system. I just know that in my experience in 19 years on the police force, when people take meth, bad things can happen. Bad things can happen to me, bad things can happen to the public. And so whether it's a little bit of meth or a lot of meth, I don't know. I got to do what I got to do to subdue this witness. And that's what I was thinking, which is why I'm not guilty of murder.
Right. And I think the response to that is you don't know exactly how much, but you can observe George Floyd. And that's what you are trained to do, Officer Chauvin. I think the response is, look, we have to acknowledge that there were drugs in George Floyd's system, because there were. That's a fact of this particular case. But what you say is, Officer Chauvin, you have to make a moment-by-moment assessment of the person you are interacting with. Now, even acknowledging that he did have drugs in his system, that the cashier at the where he was buying the cigarette said, yes, he was acting a little strange. The question is whether that gives rise to the legitimacy of the actions that Officer Chauvin took. So you can still say, okay, you can have drugs in your system, but are you justified in having your knee on somebody's neck for almost 9 minutes when, again, at this point, it looks like they are subdued, like they're not a threat, even considering the witnesses who are talking to you. So I don't know that is, I think that there's enough there for the prosecution to say, police officers should be trained in people who might be under the influence. It doesn't mean that every time you interact with somebody who's under the influence, you can use X, Y, Z amount of force. You still have to observe them and their behavior.
And Jessica, let me play what I thought, at least for me as a reporter, as somebody who, when I'm in the field, talking to people that have borne witness to mass tragedies, to acts of God that have destroyed homes, to acts of terror that have killed family members. You know, as a reporter, you often, when you're listening to people tell these stories, you feel it in your heart. You objectively report what they say and what happened, but as a human being, you feel the pain and the suffering in a small way that the people you're talking to feel. And to me, this next bit of testimony from Dr. Thomas really sort of hit me in the gut. I want to play it.
Do you have an opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, if Mr. Floyd would have died that night had he not been subject to the subdual and restraint of the police?
There's no evidence to suggest he would have died that night, except for the interactions with law enforcement.
I mean, Jessica, that hit me like a ton of bricks, because it essentially says, yes, he had ingested some narcotics. Yes, he had a history of, medical conditions that could potentially be dangerous, and perhaps were dangerous. But had he not encountered police on this specific day, he would still be alive today, or at least he wouldn't have died that night.
Right. I think that statement was legally and emotionally gutting, because what she acknowledged, or what she said, was, yes, Officer Chauvin was the substantial cause. And this is, to your question, which is, if George Floyd had not had that interaction with Officer Chauvin, would he have still been alive a day, a week, a few months later? And she's saying, yes, he would not have died that night, but for the interaction he had with Officer Chauvin. And it is just, you're right, it's emotionally gutting as well. And just on a human level, you have this impulse that you want to rewind the tape. We all know how the video ends. We all know what happened. We all know why we're here talking about this. It's because George Floyd died. But you still have this moment of, well, can't we go back in time? Can't we change what happened? And you heard that from some of the witnesses the first week. You heard the cashier from the cup of soup store who said, I wish I just had let him use that $20 bill. I feel like I was part of setting this in motion. And part of what the prosecution is doing, I think, is building this case of there are all these moments where things could have gone a different way. If Officer Chauvin had just de-escalated the situation, if he had just moved his knee off of George Floyd's neck earlier, if he had just fill in the blank, then we would not be talking about a murder trial. And I think that this, Vlad, you said it landed like a gut punch for you. And I suspect that the same is true for the jurors.
So I know we still have yet to hear from the witnesses that the defense is going to call, but would you advise Derek Chauvin that, just knowing what we know now, not having heard from the defense witnesses, that you would advise him to take the stand? I know we've talked about in the past that sometimes the way that we, the people in this country, are protected is by not having to take the stand, right? Because sometimes when you do, you might ultimately make your situation worse. But it strikes me that just given what we've heard, that it might behoove Mr. Chauvin to take the stand, that the one thing that might actually save him from a harsher indictment is to say whatever it is he wants to say about what he was thinking and what he was doing in that night that might give us some insight. Because when you have a testimony like that, which says that the only reason that George Floyd is dead or died that night is because he encountered not police, Derek Chauvin. Don't you think that, would you advise him to do so, or is it still a situation where, I'm not sure?
I think it's still dicey, and this is why most defendants do not, in fact, take the stand. So I understand from our perspective, it feels like the prosecution's doing a fantastic job, and that's because they are. And let's remember that there was a previous plea deal in this case where Officer Chauvin did agree to plead to certain charges, and that was essentially unraveled by our former Attorney General, Bill Barr. It's not to say anything other than Officer Chauvin had an acknowledgement that there was a strong case against him and did agree to certain penalties, which, of course, that plea deal fell apart for a variety of different reasons. But would I advise him to take the stand? On the one hand, again, is like, do you only have that Hail Mary pass left? And that Hail Mary pass is him saying, please listen from my perspective. Please listen to my words. And to try and humanize himself. Say, I'm a person, here's what I did, and here's why I did it. The problem for Officer Chauvin and for a lot of defendants is that none of us are angels and have spotless records. And that is particularly true of Officer Chauvin, who I believe had almost 24 complaints against him in his time on the force. So the prosecution is going to be ready with a discussion of all of those cases where where there were complaints against Officer Chauvin, complaints about excessive force, and they will say, this is not a one-off. Now that you've come on the stand, Officer Chauvin, let's go ahead and open up that book and let's look at a broader timeline of this being a very consistent pattern of behavior. You got caught this time because there was a video, because somebody died, but this is what you've done for a long time. And I'm not sure if, that calculation, that could be really the end of the case.
That is really, really interesting. So so then we talked about early in the trial how the prosecution made clear some of the things that we now know, which they were upfront about George Floyd's, drug use. They were upfront about certain things that you were already hearing, either through the media or through the defense attorneys about George Floyd, that they were going to use to try and say, this is why Derek Chauvin behaved the way that he did. Could then the defense also say, well, let's talk about, before not putting Chauvin on the stand, but in bringing up some of their own witnesses, say, well, look, there had been some citizen complaints. I don't know specifically what they are, but there had been some citizen complaints, for example, and his superiors didn't see fit to take him, off the force or to fire him or to do anything retaliatory against him. But all of a sudden now they have a problem with his training. They have a problem with the way that he, executes All right, so I'm told that the trial is picking back up, Jessica, but you could see where I was sort of going with that, which is, let me try and preempt that by saying, like, in all the other instances that he's been called out, we've been able to figure out a way to say that this is because of the situation that he found himself in, that all police officers find themselves in. We'll talk about it after. Thank you.
Thank you.